Microsoft just released the preview version of the C# Dev Kit for VS Code. I'm really excited about this for a number of reasons. First, it elevates what we can do in VS Code with C# projects. Second, it allows non.NET developers to easily work with .NET projects in their native environment. For instance, my web developer handles my HTML and CSS work. However, when I give him a C# project, he has to use the full version of Visual Studio. Now he can use VS Code more easily. Third, this meets people where they're at. If you're already familiar with VS Code, now you can more easily develop C# projects as well. In this video, I'm going to go over what this extension does, where it is at in the development process, and more. This is still an early pre-release, so there's a long way to go. However, what we already have is a big step up from where we were. Now, before we dive in, I want to share a few things with you. First, if you're interested in improving your C# skills, be sure to subscribe to this channel. With over 500 C# videos and counting, it's the perfect place to learn and grow your skills. Second, if you're looking for free C# resources, head on over to iamtimcorey.com and check out the resources tab. You'll find my podcast, the C# projects page, and much more. And third, if you're ready for a deeper dive into a specific C# topic, I have a variety of courses that can help. Not only will you receive a world-class education, but you'll also help fund my free content so that everyone can have a great education in C#, not just those who can afford it. So let's jump over to VS Code. This is VS Code. I have it open with no folder open. I do have a number of extensions installed, but the one extension we're going to focus on today is, if you go to installed here, the C# Dev Kit. This is a new extension. Notice it's marked as preview. The version right now is 0.1.83. That means, yes, it's a brand new extension. It's just been released recently, and this is officially from Microsoft.com. So when you install this, one of the things it's going to ask you to do is make sure that you install, it will do it for you, but install the pre-release version of the C# package for Visual Studio as well. But we'll install a few things. So you have things like IntelliSense, IntelliCode, and more support in VS Code. There's a lot of stuff this can do. And again, this is just starting out, but this C# Dev Kit is a really big step up for VS Code developers. So let's look at what it is and what it does. Let's go over here to the Explorer view. And since I have no folder open up, I have the ability to open a folder, but also have this new option down here that I can create a .NET project. Now, if we want to open a .NET solution that already exists, which is probably the more common thing to do with this tool right now, you just open a folder. So just open a folder like you normally would in VS Code, and it will recognize, hey, this is a .NET project. I can give you the .NET goodness that I have. But what we're going to do first is create a brand new project just to kind of see how this works, where the edges are, what works so far and what doesn't. Then we'll open up an existing project that has even more stuff. So let's get started. Let's start by saying create a .NET project. Now it's going to say, what .NET project do you want? Now, you may be looking for the Visual Studio, visual template display with all the goodness of Visual Studio, but that's not how VS Code works. And that's important to note here, is that while this is the C# Dev Kit for Visual Studio Code, it is not intending to turn VS Code into Visual Studio. It intends to work with VS Code and the way VS Code works and just go with that flow. So it's a different flow than if you have full Visual Studio. Now, if you want full Visual Studio, use Visual Studio. But with VS Code, we're going to have the VS Code flow. So let's choose something simple here. Let's go to the console app. You can also search here, say console, and there you go. And it's going to say, where do you want this thing? Now let's put this on my temp folder, and I'm going to create a new folder here. Let's call this console sample app. And in here, say select folder, and it's going to create for me a console project now, or solution, and then a project. So now it's saying, hey, what do you want to name the project? That's the folder we just created. It's going to be a solution folder. Let's call this demo console app. And now we have a console application. Notice we're in Explorer right here, and it looks like you would normally see inside of VS Code. You can have all your files. Notice the hidden files as well, and you have the bin and the OBJ, and this is kind of normal for how you'd work with C#. This is not something specific to the C# dev kit. However, if you note down here, if you collapse this down, notice the next option down is Solution Explorer. This is the new thing. So if you open this up, this looks a lot more like Visual Studio, where we have dependencies and we have the program.cs. We don't have the OBJ and bin folder. We don't have the hidden VS Code stuff, because this is the file explorer up here. This is just exploring all the files like you would normally in any other VS Code project. This is a Solution Explorer, which is more like what we see in Visual Studio. And if you click it, you can see we have our C# program. And if I want to, what I can do is right-click on the project and say debug, start a new instance. And we'll build the project. And when it's done, it will run the project. There you go. Hello world is right there. That's the console at hello world. It's kind of all in line with all the rest of the debugging stuff. But that's where we have our application. The application runs, it works. We can make modifications to it. In fact, let's do a couple of modifications. So let's create a new file. And notice that this is the template window for what kind of file do you want in your project. Well, I want a class file. Let's call this person model. And create the person model.cs file. Notice it uses also the file scope namespaces, and it creates a public class person model. I actually prefer this to what's in Visual Studio right now, where we have multiple different templates that work differently. So this is actually a nice step up. And let's just create a couple of properties. Now notice that GitHub Copilot is saying, hey, you know what? You probably want this stuff. So let's go ahead and hit tab. That works for me. In fact, let's take age off. We don't need to have 3 properties. Now, look what we have here. We have the yellow squigglies, which says, hey, there's a warning here, not an error, just a warning. But what is that warning? Well, it's a non-null property, but it must contain a non-null value when exiting the constructor. This is because if we click on the project, we can see nullable is enabled. If I were to say disable and save that and come back over here, those go away. So if I turn off nullability warnings, that goes away. If I turn them back on and I save that, they'll come back. So this is working a lot like Visual Studio now. Also notice the references. We can click on the references if there's any references to our object. Now we can create a constructor for this. And notice there's a snippet right here. We can create that constructor snippet. And it's saying, hey, parameters, well, let's say string first name. And notice again, Copilot saying, hey, I can help you out. That's, oh, I did miss that. It doubled up my curly braces. But there we go. Now we have our nullability problem taken care of, and we've got a constructor set up to assign its properties. This is nothing special as far as C# goes, but we can now use that. So let's get rid of this, and we're going to have a using directive up here, using demo console app. That you have to do that when you're in a program.cs because of the fact that it's not actually in a namespace. That's something new with the new way we're doing console apps in .NET 6+. But we can now say person model. Let's do this for now, and then we're going to say console right line hello first name last name. Okay, cool. And if we were to run this, well, first of all, let's talk about running this because we don't really want to run this in the integrated terminal. And in fact, let's put our console read line at the end. Notice IntelliSense pops up very easily. But what if I want to run it not in the integrated terminal? Well, we'll get to that, and I'll show you how in just a minute. But for now, let's just debug this just to make sure it works. Okay, and of course it's going to, but I want to make sure you see hello John Doe. Cool. But now if I want to come up here and say console.write was your first name, capture the first name, was your last name, and really GitHub Copilot's really helpful here. It's either Copilot or IntelliCode. You can't really tell which. Let's stop that, by the way. Now with this, by the way, we're just going to say that, yes, they return a value. They're not nullable. We're going to say that this is first name and that this is last name. Okay, so now we create a person model. We say hello, that person name. Cool. Again, nothing crazy here except for the fact that you run this project and you try to run it, it's going to have a problem. And the reason it has a problem, failed to read environmental variable, and then nothing. Kind of pauses here. We don't know why. Well, the issue is actually one that's pretty common with VS Code in general. And if we were using the older way of using C# and VS Code, we'd still have this problem. And that is that the integrated console is not what we want to use for console applications that require a read line. So instead what we'll do is we'll change this to use something different. Let's go back to our files and under VS Code. Now, again, notice I went out of Solution Explorer and went back to the files, which is the console sample app. That's the folder name. And I go to VS Code, there's a settings.json. And in here, there's one setting, .NET default solution, right? You put a comma after this and put your double quotes and say C# dot. Notice IntelliSense here allows us to look through and see what are the options we could set. But we want C#.debug.console, and you want it to be an external terminal. Now you can also do an integrated terminal, but the default value of internal console is not the one we want. But let's do external terminal. Close this down, come back over here to my Solution Explorer, right-click on my project, and say debug start new instance. And when it does, what's going to happen is going to pop up a new terminal like we're used to with Visual Studio. Tim, Corey, hello, Tim, Corey. If I hit enter again, it goes away. That's because we're using console readline to pause. If you don't have that right there, it wouldn't pause. It would go right away. You wouldn't see the hello, Tim, Corey. So that's how to work with a console application very simply, very easily inside of this new Solution Explorer experience. Now there are, like I said, this is a very early access and there's some things that you have to work through. One of them is, notice down here in our C#, it says subscription and it knows who I am because it's installed. Well, you have to at least log in and say, hey, this is who I am, but it works just like Visual Studio 2022 for Community Edition, where you can just log in. I mean, it doesn't matter who you are. You get a license, and for nothing. It's free, but it is using a licensing model for that. So you just need to make sure you can log in. There is a couple of bugs in there they're working through. If you go to their GitHub page, you'll see their list of bugs and their list of high priority or highly reported bugs, and they have that list there for you, and that's one of those. But the other thing is, if we were to, and again, this is something that's been reported and is probably in the works, I would assume, is if you were to add a new project, we can do that. New project, I just push the plus here, and I can say, hey, I want a class library. Cool. Oops, I double-clicked, I think. Class library, there we go. And we'll call this demo lib. And the default directory, which creates a new directory for demo lib. All right, and cool, I've got a demo library, but now how do I make a dependency from this demo library, or, how does the console depend on the library? Well, right now you have to do it through the command line. There's not a good GUI way, at least not that I've found yet. I don't believe there is one yet. So yeah, that's something that would be something you have to work through and know how to drop down into the .NET console in order to run a .NET command to associate the two. where it's kind of like a Git client, where when Git clients are first start out and they first start making a Git client, they'll do the kind of the happy path and the normal stuff. So stage a file, commit a file, create, push the commit up and pull the commits down, and maybe even do a pull request. And those kind of the basics. But then we have the more advanced stuff. You have to learn how to drop down the console. And that's where we're at right now still with this Solution Explorer. But what it's allowing us to do is do less and less on the console. And eventually, hopefully, nothing on the console will be needed in order to do your normal everyday work. So, but there's one of those edges you'll see. Now, this is where I say that probably this extension is more useful right now for people who want to work on a project that already exists. So let's do that. Let's go over here to a project that already exists, the Blazor sample app. Nope, Blazor demo app. I have so many samples. Blazor demo app. And if I just right click in this folder and say open with VSCode or open with code, it's going to open that project, and notice, watch up here, we're going to add upper left-hand corner, we add the Solution Explorer next. So it's figured out, oh, this has got a solution in it with 2 projects. Let's go ahead and open that for you. And if this is the Blazor demo, which is a Blazor application, if I were to right click on this and say debug, start new instance, wait for it to launch. And once it does, it's going to launch my application in the browser. There we go. So hello, YouTube. This is a sample application to show off the C# dev box in VS Code. This is something I built with Visual Studio and then just close, and now I can open it really quickly in VS Code. Now, let's hit stop here. And actually, you know what? I'm sorry. Let's start this again, because there's one thing I want to point out that happened that's a little bit different, and I'm still working through what the best practices here are. But notice that it's HTTP, not HTTPS. So that might not be what you want for testing. So let's close this out and look at why that is. If you look at the project, and this is the standard project that comes in Visual Studio, but under profiles, it pulls the first profile and just executes that. And that's the HTTP profile with localhost 5293. If you were to delete this, there's other ways of going about this, but if you were to delete this, so there's not that profile there. And then you have the next one down is the HTTPS profile, which has both HTTP and HTTPS versions. And if you were then to execute this again, it will execute the HTTPS version because it has the redirect in place. And now you have that HTTPS there for testing out your site with SSL. So just so you know, that's a quick way around that, but it does change your source code for all your projects, not just for the VS Code version. There are ways you can go into settings for VS Code and change that as well. I've covered that before in VS Code videos, but just note that's one of those things. Now, the reason I want to show off this project is because there are 2 projects here, and one of them is a sample test project. And if you notice over here on the left, we have testing. If you click on this, it's already run the tests. And we have 2 passing tests and a failing test. The passing tests are called passing test, another passing test, and the failing test is called failing test. And if we click on the failing test and say, hey, what's going on here? We can debug the test. We can go to test. There's go to test and look at the test, or we can run this test. So right now, I've got, this is X unit, and I'm saying, hey, fact, assert 4 equals 2. Well, of course, that's not correct. And of course, these are 4 is 4 and 5 is 5, but 4 does not equal 2. Now, if I were to come in here and say, oh, I forgot times 2, let's click on this X right here to click to run a test. It's going to run this test again, check it out, and now it's a passing test. We have all of our tests passing. We should probably change the name of this method then to passing failing test or whatever. So this is how you can do unit testing right in your VS Code as well. And there's a lot more stuff that this C# dev kit can do, but it really just shows you that, very quickly you can take an existing project, just open it up and go, make some changes, and just start working. So for example, I have my web developer working on some CSS, especially for some pages that I created. Well, Visual Studio Code is excellent at CSS. It's really good at making sure that, we have all the IntelliSense and all the rest for CSS, and that we have the code completions and figuring out where things are and all the rest. Well, now he gets to use this instead of having to go to Visual Studio, which is a bit more clunky when it comes to working with CSS and web projects compared to what we have, the light and quick VS Code. So there's a lot of benefits here to a lot of different use cases for working with C# in Visual Studio Code. This is not a replacement for the full Visual Studio. There's a lot of stuff that the full Visual Studio does that VS Code's version will never do. It's just not capable of all of that without becoming bogged down like Visual Studio is. So I don't think that we're going to see a case where we eliminate one. I think there's two different use cases for two different scenarios. But I think that this dev kit for C# for Visual Studio Code is a really powerful addition. It's another tool in our toolbox to be able to allow us to very quickly make modifications to applications without having to open full Visual Studio and have all the extra overhead that we might not need. So that's my initial impressions, initial overview of the VS Code extension called C# Dev Kit. I'd love to know what you think. Try it out, play with it, see if it's right for you, and if it maybe can aid you in being a little faster and a little better at development with C#. Okay, let me know what your thoughts are down in the comments. And again, this is just a preview version. It's 0.0.1. So we'll see more of this as it gets closer to the actual release version, where a lot more stuff's going to come into play, a lot more bug fixes and changes are going to happen over the course of the coming months. So keep an eye out. We're going to do more content on this, but I want to give you kind of a sneak peek at what's coming up for Visual Studio Code. Thanks for watching. And as always, I am Tim Corey.